The crystal chandeliers above the ballroom of the Jefferson Grand Hotel in Boston cast geometric shadows across the marble floor. At 32, Rebecca Hayes stood at the edge of her own engagement party, champagne flute in hand, watching her fiancé Christopher lean too close to a woman in a sapphire dress. The woman laughed at something he said, her diamond bracelet catching the light. A bracelet that cost more than Rebecca's annual salary as a community outreach coordinator. Christopher's hand lingered on the woman's lower back. Casual, familiar, possessive. Rebecca's fingers tightened around the champagne glass. She'd seen that gesture before, directed at her, back when his attention hadn't been a commodity to be traded. The woman turned slightly, and Rebecca recognized her. Victoria Ashford, heiress to the Ashford Hotel's empire, daughter of one of Boston's most influential families. She'd been introduced earlier as Christopher's new business partner. Business partner. The phrase tasted like ash. Rebecca set down her glass and walked toward them, her steps measured, controlled. She'd spent 3 years supporting Christopher through law school, working double shifts at the nonprofit while he studied. She'd believed in him, in them, in the future they were supposed to build together. He noticed her approaching and stepped back from Victoria, but not quickly enough. Not guiltily enough. Entitled, Rebecca thought. He looked entitled to this. Victoria smiled, the kind of smile that didn't reach the eyes. Cold calculation lived there, the assessment of someone who knew exactly what she wanted and how to take it. Welcome to Leora Folktales, where stories unfold like chapters of life you didn't know you needed to hear. If you're new here, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss a story that might just change your perspective. Drop a comment and let me know where you're watching from. Are you in New York, Los Angeles, somewhere across the ocean? I love knowing where our community is tuning in from. Now let's get back to Rebecca's story, because what happens next is something nobody saw coming. Christopher cleared his throat, a tell she'd learned to recognize over the years. It meant he was about to say something she wouldn't like. He thought he was being diplomatic. He thought he was being kind. He had no idea what kindness actually looked like. The engagement party continued around them, 200 guests oblivious to the fracture forming at the center of the celebration. Her mother was laughing with Christopher's parents across the room. Her father was deep in conversation with the mayor. Everyone looked so happy. Everyone except Rebecca. She looked at Christopher and saw a stranger wearing a familiar face. 5 years of memories of late-night conversations and shared dreams. And somehow she'd missed the moment when he'd stopped seeing her as a partner and started seeing her as a stepping stone. He opened his mouth to speak, but Victoria's hand on his arm stopped him. The other woman's smile widened, sympathetic in the way predators sometimes mimic empathy before the kill. Victoria spoke first, her voice smooth, practiced, the tone of someone accustomed to getting what they want. She said she hoped there were no hard feelings, that these things happened, that surely Rebecca understood. She said Christopher needed someone who could match his ambitions, someone who moved in the right circles, someone who could open the right doors. She said it so reasonably, as if she were explaining basic mathematics to a child. Rebecca felt something shift inside her chest, something cold and sharp and clarifying. She'd been playing a game without knowing the rules, and these two had been playing it for months, maybe longer. Christopher finally found his voice, and what he said next would echo in Rebecca's mind for weeks. He said he cared about her, that she was wonderful, that any man would be lucky to have her, but his career required certain connections, certain advantages. He said Victoria understood his world in ways Rebecca never could. He said it wasn't personal. It was never personal with men like Christopher. It was always strategic, calculated, a cost-benefit analysis where love came in somewhere below networking opportunities and social capital. He said he hoped they could remain friends. Friends. The word hung between them, absurd and insulting. Rebecca looked at him, really looked at him, and wondered how she'd ever thought she knew this person. The Christopher she'd fallen for at 27 didn't exist anymore, if he ever had. This version standing before her, with his designer suit and his practiced apologies, was someone else entirely. Someone she didn't particularly like. She could have made a scene. The old Rebecca, the one from an hour ago who still believed in fairy tales, might have cried or shouted or demanded explanations. But the woman standing in the Jefferson Grand Ballroom, surrounded by people who didn't know her world was ending, did none of those things. She smiled, the kind of smile she perfected during 3 years of donor dinners and fundraising galas. The smile that said everything was fine when nothing was. She congratulated them both, her voice steady, almost warm. She said she hoped they'd be very happy together. Then she walked away, her heels clicking against marble, her spine straight, her head high. She walked past her parents, past Christopher's family, past the ice sculpture of intertwined hearts that suddenly seemed obscene in its optimism. She walked out of the ballroom, down the corridor, through the lobby, and into the October night air that bit cold and clean against her skin. Only when she reached her car, a 10-year-old Honda with a dent in the passenger door, did she let herself feel it. The humiliation, the betrayal, the rage that burned hotter than grief. She sat in the driver's seat, hands gripping the steering wheel, breathing carefully through her nose. Her phone buzzed. 12 texts from her mother. 8 missed calls from her best friend Rachel. She ignored them all. Instead, she opened her contacts and scrolled to a name she hadn't called in 7 years. Thomas Hayes. Uncle Thomas, though he wasn't really her uncle. Just her father's college roommate who'd made different choices, taken different paths. He'd offered her a job once, right after college, but she turned it down to stay in Boston with Christopher. She typed a message, her thumb steady on the screen. 3 words that would change everything. "I'm ready now." The response came within minutes, as if he'd been waiting years for her to ask. An address in Chicago. A date 2 weeks away. A promise that nothing would ever be the same. Rebecca Hayes drove home that night still wearing her engagement ring, but by morning it would be in a drawer she'd never open again. By the end of the month, she'd be gone from Boston, from the nonprofit, from the life she'd built around a man who'd traded her for a better offer. What Christopher and Victoria didn't know, what nobody except Thomas knew, was that Rebecca Hayes wasn't just a community coordinator with a graduate degree in social work. She was the sole heir to the Hayes Industries fortune, a privately held conglomerate worth $3.7 billion, carefully hidden behind trusts and shell companies and her father's insistence on privacy. Her father, William Hayes, had built his empire from nothing, and he'd taught his daughter to value people over position, character over capital. He'd wanted her to live a normal life, to find love without the complication of wealth, to know who truly cared about her. So they'd hidden it, all of it, and Rebecca had worked her way through life like everyone else. Student loans and apartment shares and budgets that stretched thin at month's end. If you're still watching at this point, drop a comment with "I'm still here." Let's see who's truly following this shocking story. Because the revenge Rebecca is about to orchestrate isn't just about heartbreak. It's about power, precision, and a reckoning nobody will see coming. Chicago welcomed her with gray skies and wind that cut through even the warmest coat. Thomas met her at his office on the 48th floor of the Sterling Tower, floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Lake Michigan. He looked older than she remembered, silver threading through his dark hair. But his eyes were sharp, assessing, the eyes of someone who'd built empires and destroyed them. He didn't offer sympathy or ask about Christopher. Instead, he handed her a folder 3 inches thick. Her inheritance, laid out in portfolios and property deeds and stock certificates. Her father had died 2 years ago, a heart attack that took him in his sleep, and the fortune had passed to her through trusts designed to activate when she turned 32. She hadn't known because she'd been so focused on Christopher, on building their future, that she'd never asked the right questions. Thomas explained it all, his voice clinical, professional. She had controlling interest in 17 companies, real estate across 4 continents, investment portfolios that generated passive income most people couldn't earn in a lifetime of work. She had options, leverage, the kind of power that could reshape industries or destroy careers. She had everything Christopher had wanted from Victoria Ashford, and he'd thrown her away without knowing it. The irony tasted sweet. Thomas asked what she wanted to do. Rebecca looked at the folder, at the numbers that still felt abstract, surreal, and thought about Christopher's hand on Victoria's back. She thought about the engagement party, about her mother's confusion, about the humiliation of being dismissed like an employee whose contract wasn't being renewed. She thought about the 3 years she'd given him, the dreams she'd deferred, the version of herself she'd compressed to fit his vision of a supportive girlfriend. Then she thought about Victoria Ashford, with her diamond bracelet and her entitled smile, who'd taken what didn't belong to her without a second thought. Rebecca Hayes made her first decision as a billionaire heiress. She told Thomas she wanted to buy the Ashford Hotel's empire. He smiled, the first genuine emotion she'd seen from him, and said he'd make the calls. It took 6 months of careful maneuvering, shell companies acquiring stock through intermediaries, pressure applied in boardrooms she never personally entered. 6 months of watching from a distance as the Ashford empire began to crack, tiny fissures that spread like ice across a windshield. Victoria's father fought back, but he was fighting shadows, legal entities with names that meant nothing, investors who appeared from nowhere with offers he couldn't refuse. By month 5, he knew someone was targeting him. By month 6, he was desperate enough to take meetings with anyone. That's when Rebecca stepped into the light. She walked into the Ashford Hotel's corporate headquarters in Manhattan on a Tuesday morning in April, wearing a charcoal suit that cost more than her old monthly rent. Her hair was different, styled by professionals who understood the psychology of power. Her makeup was subtle but precise, the armor of someone who belonged in these spaces. She didn't announce herself. She simply walked to the executive floor like she owned it, because legally, as of 8 o'clock that morning, she did. Victoria's father, Richard Ashford, looked up from his desk when she entered his office, confusion flickering across his face before recognition settled in. He knew her from somewhere, the engagement party perhaps, Christopher's charity case girlfriend who'd disappeared. He had no idea who she really was. Not yet. Rebecca smiled, the same smile she'd given Christopher and Victoria that night at the Jefferson Grand, and introduced herself properly for the first time. Rebecca Hayes, majority shareholder and new CEO of Ashford Hotels. The color drained from Richard's face. He stammered something about hostile takeovers and legal action, but they both knew it was over. Every move had been legal, every acquisition clean, every step documented by lawyers who charged $1,000 an hour. He'd been outmaneuvered by someone he'd never seen coming, and the realization was devastating. Rebecca sat down across from him, crossed her legs, and laid out her terms. He could stay on in a consulting capacity with a generous severance package, or he could fight and lose everything including his reputation. She gave him 24 hours to decide. He took 12. By that evening, the news broke across financial networks. Ashford Hotels acquired in stunning boardroom coup by Hayes Industries heir. The business world scrambled to understand who Rebecca Hayes was, and where she'd come from. Reporters dug into her background and found nothing but a community coordinator who disappeared from Boston 6 months ago. The pieces didn't fit, which made the story even more compelling. Rebecca's phone buzzed with messages. Her mother, frantic and confused. Rachel demanding answers. And Christopher finally after 6 months of silence. One text that said simply, "We need to talk." She deleted it without responding. What she wanted wasn't a conversation. It was something else entirely. Something that required patience and perfect timing. The kind of revenge that didn't announce itself but unfolded slowly. Inevitably. Like a chess game where your opponent doesn't realize they're in check until it's too late for defense. She called Thomas and told him about the next acquisition she wanted to make. the law firm where Christopher had just made junior partner. Thomas laughed, understanding immediately, and said he'd handle it. Christopher's firm, Brennan and Associates, specialized in corporate law with a client list that included some of Boston's oldest money. Christopher had networked his way to partnership through Victoria's connections, leveraging her family name to open doors his talent alone never could. He thought he'd made it, thought he'd secured his future. He had no idea how fragile his foundation actually was. Rebecca moved back to Boston in June, not to the modest apartment in Somerville she'd left, but to a penthouse in the Seaport district with views that stretched across the harbor. She kept a low profile, attending charity galas and museum fundraisers where Boston's elite gathered, always dressed impeccably, always gracious, always one step removed from the center of attention. People knew her name now, knew her wealth, but few knew her story. She was new money made old through her father's legacy, respectable enough to be welcomed but mysterious enough to be interesting. She saw Christopher and Victoria at these events, watched them from across crowded rooms, noted how his confidence had grown with his bank account. He'd proposed to Victoria in March, a spectacle at the Four Seasons that made the society pages. They were planning a wedding for September, something grand and traditional, exactly the kind of event Christopher had always wanted. Rebecca smiled when she heard about it, the same smile that had become her signature, and made a phone call to Thomas. 2 weeks later, Brennan and Associates announced a merger with Heiress Legal Group, a powerhouse firm based in Chicago with tentacles in every major market. The merger was presented as a partnership, but anyone who read the fine print understood it was an acquisition. Heiress Legal Group now controlled 70% of Brennan's equity. New management would be installed. Restructuring would be necessary. Some partners would be retained, others let go. The decision would be made by the new CEO, who would be announced shortly. Christopher called Rebecca the day the news broke, his voice tight with panic. She almost didn't answer, but curiosity won. His first words weren't about the firm or the merger or the implications for his career. They were an accusation, sharp and entitled. He asked if she was behind this, if this was revenge, if she really thought she could come back to Boston and ruin his life. Rebecca let the silence stretch, counting heartbeats before she spoke. Her voice was calm, almost bored, the tone of someone discussing the weather. She told him she had no idea what he was talking about. She said Heiress Legal Group made strategic acquisitions based on market analysis and growth potential. Nothing personal. She said if he had concerns about his position, he should speak with the Human Resources Department like everyone else. Then she hung up, not abruptly but with finality, and blocked his number. She didn't need to speak with him again. Everything she wanted to say would be said through actions, through the dismantling of the life he'd built on her discarded foundation. The next move came in July, when Heiress Industries announced a massive redevelopment project in Boston's financial district. A 40-story tower that would house offices, luxury apartments, and street-level retail. The project would bring jobs, tax revenue, and prestige to the city, and the mayor announced it with fanfare at a press conference Rebecca attended. What wasn't announced, what only a few people knew, was that the land for the development had been acquired from a holding company owned by Victoria's family. They'd been forced to sell, quietly, under pressure from debts that had mounted faster than Richard Ashford could manage. His empire was crumbling piece by piece, and nobody could trace the cause back to a single source. Rebecca stood at the podium answering questions from reporters, poised and articulate, the perfect heiress stepping into her legacy. Cameras flashed. Microphones thrust forward. Someone asked about her personal life, if she was seeing anyone, if the rumors about her past relationship were true. She smiled and deflected, saying she preferred to keep her private life private, that she was focused on her work and her father's vision for the company. Nobody pushed because that's how wealth works. It buys privacy, discretion, the right to control your narrative. Christopher and Victoria's wedding was scheduled for September 15th at the Harbor Club, an exclusive venue that required membership approval and deposits that could fund a small car. Rebecca received an invitation in early August, a heavy cream envelope with gilt edging, her name written in calligraphy. She stared at it for a long time, considering. Victoria had sent it, she was certain. Not out of reconciliation or forgiveness, but out of something else. A power play, a statement: look at what I have that you don't. Look at what I won. Rebecca RSVP'd that she'd attend, alone, and marked the date in her calendar. The weeks leading up to the wedding were a study in controlled chaos. Christopher's position at the firm was under review, his cases reassigned, his office relocated to a smaller space on a lower floor. The new management, hand-picked by Rebecca though her name appeared nowhere on the paperwork, had determined his billables didn't justify partnership-level compensation. He was being demoted, gradually, professionally, in ways that left him no legal recourse. Victoria's family faced their own challenges. The Ashford Hotel's sale had been finalized, and while Richard kept his consulting position, the actual power had shifted entirely. Every decision went through Rebecca's team. Every expense was scrutinized. The generous dividends that had funded Victoria's lifestyle were restructured, redirected, invested in growth rather than distributed to family members. She was still wealthy, but not in the way she'd been. Not in the way that bought diamond bracelets without checking price tags. Rebecca watched it all from a distance, receiving reports from Thomas, from her lawyers, from the network of professionals who now worked for her. She felt nothing, no triumph or satisfaction, just the cold clarity of a plan executing perfectly. September 15th arrived with the kind of weather that wedding planners pray for. Clear skies, mild temperature, a breeze off the harbor that smelled like salt and possibility. Rebecca dressed carefully. A navy dress that was elegant without being flashy, heels that added 3 inches to her height, jewelry that was real but understated. She looked like money, old money, the kind that didn't need to announce itself. The Harbor Club was everything Victoria would want, traditional and exclusive, with waiters in white jackets and champagne served in crystal flutes. Rebecca arrived alone, walking into the ceremony just as the music started, sliding into a seat near the back. She watched Christopher at the altar, nervous and eager, straightening his tie repeatedly. She watched Victoria appear at the entrance, radiant in white lace, her father at her side looking diminished somehow, older than he should. The ceremony was traditional, vows spoken with conviction, rings exchanged with trembling hands. Christopher looked at Victoria like she was everything he'd ever wanted, and maybe she was. Maybe that was the point, that people got exactly what they deserved. The reception was held in the ballroom. 200 guests celebrating a union that everyone agreed was perfect, ideal. The merger of two ambitious people who understood what mattered. Rebecca moved through the crowd like a ghost, polite and distant, accepting congratulations from people who didn't know what they were congratulating her for. She saw her mother across the room, still confused by the transformation, by the daughter who disappeared one night and returned as someone else. They hadn't spoken much since Rebecca had revealed everything. A dinner conversation that had ended with her mother in tears and Rebecca unmoved. Some bridges once burned stayed that way. The speeches started after dinner. Victoria's maid of honor talked about destiny and true love. Christopher's best man made jokes about law school and late-night studying. Then Christopher stood, microphone in hand, and thanked everyone for coming to celebrate with them. He talked about finding the right person, about knowing when something was meant to be, about the importance of ambition and partnership. He looked at Victoria with such earnest affection that Rebecca almost felt sorry for him. Almost, but not quite. Because what Christopher didn't know, what nobody in that ballroom knew except Rebecca and Thomas, was that at midnight, the final piece of her plan would execute. Hayes Legal Group's new CEO would be announced. The restructuring would be finalized, and Christopher's position would be eliminated entirely, not for cause but for redundancy. with a severance package that was legally compliant but personally devastating. He'd be unemployed by tomorrow morning, his partnership dissolved, his reputation in question. Firms would wonder why Hayes' legal group hadn't retained him. Interviews would go poorly. Doors would close. The life he'd built on Victoria's connections would crumble, because those connections no longer held the power they once did. Rebecca stayed through the first dance, through the cake cutting, through the tossing of the bouquet that she didn't try to catch. She stayed until the moment felt right, until she could see on Christopher's face that he was genuinely happy, genuinely convinced he'd made the right choice. Then she left, walking out into the September night, the sounds of celebration fading behind her. She didn't look back because looking back implied regret, and Rebecca Hayes had none. The following Monday, she was in her office at Hayes Industries headquarters when Thomas called to confirm the news had broken. Christopher had been informed of his termination via email at 6 in the morning. Victoria had called her father in hysterics, demanding explanations for their financial situation. The society pages were buzzing with speculation about the Ashford family's decline and Christopher's sudden career setback. Rebecca listened to Thomas's report and felt that same cold clarity, that absence of emotion that had become familiar. She asked if there was anything else, any loose ends to address. Thomas said there was one thing, a reporter from the Boston Globe who wanted an interview about her business philosophy, her approach to acquisitions, her vision for Hayes Industries. Rebecca agreed to the interview, scheduled it for the following week, and hung up. The reporter, a woman named Jennifer who reminded Rebecca of her younger self, arrived with questions that were both expected and insightful. They talked about legacy and responsibility, about balancing profit with purpose, about what it meant to inherit wealth versus building it. Near the end, Jennifer asked about Rebecca's personal life, if there was anyone special, if marriage was something she wanted. Rebecca smiled, the smile that had become her trademark, and said she'd learned that the right partner was someone who saw you clearly, who valued you for who you were rather than what you could offer. She said she hadn't found that yet, but she wasn't worried. Some things were worth waiting for. Jennifer scribbled notes, nodded, asked one final question. Had Rebecca ever been in love? Rebecca paused, considering the question seriously. She thought about Christopher, about the girl she'd been at the Jefferson Grand Hotel, about the engagement ring in a drawer she'd eventually thrown away. She thought about the life she might have had if he'd chosen differently, if he'd valued her over Victoria's connections. She thought about all of it, and then she answered honestly. Yes, she'd been in love once. But she'd learned that love without respect was just pretty words wrapped around nothing. She'd learned that the right person wouldn't need her to be less, so they could be more. She'd learned that revenge wasn't about destruction. It was about building something so undeniable that everyone who'd underestimated you had to reckon with their mistake. Jennifer published the interview 2 weeks later, a profile that painted Rebecca as the kind of leader Boston hadn't seen in decades. Smart, strategic, uncompromising but fair. The article mentioned her past relationship briefly, a footnote about a broken engagement that had preceded her transformation. It didn't name Christopher, didn't need to. Everyone who mattered knew exactly who she was talking about. Christopher and Victoria saw the article, Rebecca was certain. She imagined them reading it over coffee in whatever apartment they could still afford. Victoria's diamond bracelet long since sold to cover expenses, Christopher's resume circulating to firms that never called back. She imagined the exact moment when they understood what had happened, when the pieces finally connected and they realized who had orchestrated their downfall. She imagined the rage, the denial, the desperate scramble to find leverage or allies or some way to fight back. There was none. Rebecca had been too careful, too patient, too thorough. Every move had been legal, every acquisition clean, every termination justified. There was no scandal to expose, no weakness to exploit. There was only the reality of consequences, the natural result of underestimating someone because they didn't look like power in a form you recognized. 6 months after the wedding, Rebecca attended another charity gala. This one for the children's hospital she'd worked with during her nonprofit days. She donated $1 million anonymously, funded a new wing, and spent the evening talking with doctors and families who had no idea who she was beyond a name on a placard. She saw Christopher across the room working security, a job someone had gotten him out of pity or obligation. He saw her too, and for a moment their eyes met. She waited to feel something, triumph or satisfaction or even pity. But there was nothing, just the neutral observation of a problem that had solved itself. She turned away and continued her conversation, and Christopher was forgotten before she finished her sentence. That night, driving home to her penthouse with the harbor lights reflected on the water, Rebecca thought about the girl she'd been. The one who'd believed in fairy tales and happy endings. That girl was gone, transformed by betrayal into someone harder, sharper, more dangerous. But also someone who understood her worth, who wouldn't settle for less than she deserved, who had learned that the best revenge wasn't destruction. It was building a life so magnificent that the people who'd hurt you became irrelevant, footnotes in a story that was never really about them at all. Rebecca Hayes parked her car, took the elevator to the 45th floor, and walked into her home, alone but not lonely. She poured a glass of wine, stood at the window looking out at the city she now helped shape, and smiled. Not the practiced smile of public appearances, but something genuine. Something that came from knowing she'd survived, transformed, emerged stronger. Christopher and Victoria would spend years trying to recover what they'd lost, blaming each other and circumstances, and the unfairness of a world that didn't reward them the way they'd expected. They'd never understand that the problem wasn't the world. It was that they'd mistaken kindness for weakness, love for leverage, and a woman's patience for acceptance. They'd underestimated Rebecca Hayes, and that mistake would cost them everything. As for Rebecca, she had an empire to run, a legacy to honor, and a future that belonged entirely to her. The past was settled, the score was even, and she had never been more free. If you made it to the end of this story, thank you for being part of this journey with Rebecca. Her transformation from betrayed fiancé to powerful CEO reminds us that the best revenge is becoming so successful that your past becomes irrelevant. If this story moved you, hit that like button, drop a comment telling me what you thought about Rebecca's strategy, and subscribe to Leora Folktales for more stories about resilience, revenge, and redemption. What would you have done in Rebecca's position? Let me know in the comments below, and I'll see you in the next story.